Look at this house. In 1720, when England was crushed by the first stock market bubble in history, its owner coolly locked in his profits from insider trading. Money for it flowed from the treasury, which he managed like his own personal wallet. For the sake of the perfect view from this lawn, an entire village was wiped off the face of the earth. And the chief architect was a former spy and playwright who had never constructed a single building before. This is not a story about beauty. It is a story of how the most cynical vanity in British history gave birth to its most romantic symbol. And I will tell you why every column here was a shot fired in an architectural war. A war this house waged against another, even more famous English palace. At dawn, as the Yorkshire fog clings to ancient oaks, it emerges from the mist like a vision. Golden stone, soaking in the first rays of sun, a majestic dome challenging the heavens. For millions around the world, this place has only one name: Brideshead. This is the England of our dreams, a symbol of aristocratic elegance, nostalgia for a bygone era, frozen in stone. Here, Regency silks rustle for the cameras of Netflix. Here, tourists stand in awe, gazing at painted ceilings, trying to capture eternity on their phones. It is a dream you can visit by buying a ticket. A place where history has been transformed into a flawless movie set. It is a beautiful, convincing illusion, and it is a lie. To understand this house, you must forget the novels and look into the cold eyes of its creator, Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle. This was no dreamer or romantic. This was a calculating predator of London's political jungle at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. A man whose fortune and power were built on ruthless intrigues and profitable alliances. This house was not born from a dream. It was forged from political ambition, a colossal ego, and money whose origins were best not examined too closely. It does not invite. It declares. It does not comfort. It overwhelms. Every column, every portico is not a gesture of hospitality, but a declaration of power. It is a monument to a man who, at a decisive moment in his career, bet not on real power, but on its stone, indestructible symbol. He lost the battle for the cabinet, but decided to win the war for immortality. And here, the central paradox of this story is born. The most ambitious and calculating politician of his time, a man who held the entire nation's treasury in his hands, a man who never took a single step without careful analysis, hires for his life's project not the best architect in England, but a playwright, an amateur, a theatrical showman who had never built anything more complex than a stage set. How did this union of ruthless calculation and theatrical amateurism give birth to an architectural masterpiece? How did a building, conceived as a weapon in a political struggle, turn into a romantic ideal? And how did it manage to outlive not only its creator and his dynasty, but the British Empire itself, defying all laws of logic, economics, and even gravity? We admire the stone, its golden, warm hue in the rays of the setting sun. We admire its scale, its harmony, the audacity of its design. But what is this stone really made of? What makes up the foundation upon which this dream rests? The answer is simple: money. But money, like people, has a history. And the history of this capital was written not in the silence of banking offices, but on the fields of political battle, in marital bedchambers, and on the decks of ships sailing from distant colonies. Every pound sterling spent here had its own pedigree. And it begins not in Yorkshire, but in the smoky, tobacco-filled clubs of London. The Earl of Carlisle was not just an aristocrat. He was a top manager in a private joint stock company called the Whig Junta. This wasn't a political party in the modern sense. It was an elite gang, a political cartel that had seized control of the state. They saw England not as a fatherland, but as an enterprise. It was a well-oiled machine where public offices were not a service, but assets, and contracts to supply the army and navy were distributed among their own, like shares in a highly profitable venture. And Carlyle, as First Lord of the Treasury, was at the main controls. But even that was not enough. The first, most important stones of this foundation were laid not by politics, but by a marriage contract. His marriage to Lady Anne Capel brought the Earl a dowry of £25,000. Today, that sum is equivalent to tens of millions. It was the startup capital, an investment that turned an architectural fantasy into a real business plan. This foundation was built on a dowry. This love story had a very precise monetary equivalent, and from there, the financial streams become even murkier, leading us far beyond the borders of England. The wealth of Carlyle and his entire class was inextricably linked to the growth of the British Empire. We see no plantations here, but every stone in this wall bears the invisible imprint of the colonial world. Money flowed from the East India Company, from the trade in sugar and tobacco, commodities whose sweetness was mixed with the labor of slaves. In this golden stone is frozen the aroma of exotic spices and the bitter taste of sweat from those whose names history has not preserved. And finally, the cherry on top, the Earl's personal genius, or cynicism. When panic gripped England in 1720, known as the collapse of the South Sea Company, thousands of investors were ruined. It was the first great stock market bubble, and when it burst, it buried entire fortunes. But not Carlyle's fortune. He, possessing insider information and political acumen, got out of the game in time with a profit. While the nation writhed in agony, he coolly counted his earnings. Political income, a profitable marriage, colonial exploitation, insider trading. These are the four pillars on which Castle Howard stands. This is not just a house built on old money. It is a monument erected on the most modern and effective financial instruments of its era. Carlyle accumulated capital with surgical precision, but he wasn't saving it for a quiet retirement. He had amassed an arsenal. Now it was time to choose a target. Why here? In the wilds of North Yorkshire, far from the centers of power in London? The answer is simple. This building wasn't designed for convenience. It was built as a strategic object. This was not a place to live. It was a place to declare victory. In politics, as in war, for every action, there is a reaction. And Earl Carlyle's main rival was not a man, but another building, being constructed hundreds of miles to the south, Blenheim Palace, a gift from a grateful nation to its greatest hero, the Duke of Marlborough. Blenheim was a symbol of national triumph. Carlyle, driven by jealousy and immense pride, decided to build his own Blenheim, but he was paying for it himself, and it had to be bigger, grander, more undeniable. It was an architectural arms race, a duel where columns were used instead of pistols and domes instead of banners. Every blueprint arriving from Oxfordshire was studied in Yorkshire with one goal: to surpass it. But how do you choose a weapon for such a war? He could have hired the best professionals, followers of the restrained scientific style of Christopher Wren. But Carlyle didn't need a builder. He needed an ideologue. He found him in London's Kit Kat Club, amidst the clinking of glasses and cigar smoke. His name was John Vanbrugh. He was a playwright, a spy, a former prisoner of the Bastille. He was anything but an architect. To his contemporaries, the choice seemed like madness. But Carlyle saw in him what he needed. He didn't need an accountant of architecture who would talk about estimates and load-bearing structures. He needed a stage director for the greatest performance of his life. And before raising the curtain, the stage had to be cleared. On this spot, where perfect lawns now stretch, stood a village, Henderskelfe, with its houses, its church, its own humble, centuries-old history. It was not moved. It was erased, wiped from the face of the earth, so that nothing would obstruct the perspective, so that not a single peasant roof would distract the view from the future grandeur. It was an absolute, almost divine display of power over the land, over people, over memory itself. And finally, the very language this building would speak, Baroque, a style that was lavish, dramatic, theatrical. But in early 18th century England, it meant something more. It was the style of Catholic kings of continental Europe, the style of absolute power. For Carlyle, a Protestant and a member of the Whig Party, which fought to limit the monarch's power, this choice was an act of unheard-of audacity. He stole their visual code. He took the architecture of the enemy and made it his own. With every curve, every statue, his house declared, "My power, the power of the new aristocrat, the power of money and political will, is no less than a king's. I don't need a sanction from heaven. I am my own king and my own god." Carlyle had chosen his weapon. He hired a director, not a builder. He was going to stage the greatest play in English history, written not with ink, but with stone. He just failed to consider that stone has a will of its own. Great buildings are born from blueprints, from precise calculations, from a deep understanding of the laws of physics. Castle Howard was born from something else. It was born from the dialogue of a play that would never be staged. On its construction site, there were 3 main characters, and their union was as brilliant as it was catastrophic. The first was the playwright, Sir John Vanbrugh. He didn't draw facades. He drew sets for a grand spectacle. He thought not in square feet, but in dramatic effects. For him, load-bearing walls were merely the wings of a stage, and corridors were enfilades for the spectacular entrance of actors. His sketches, dashed off with a feverish inspiration, were filled with a passion that was almost impossible to execute. He wanted the stone to move, to sing, to play on the spectator's emotions. He was the soul of the project. But a soul, as we know, has no weight and cannot defy gravity. And here, the second man entered the stage, the genius, Nicholas Hawksmoor, a somber, taciturn professional, the shadow of the great Christopher Wren. He was the antithesis of Vanbrugh. In the silence of his study, far from the glitter of London's salons, he took his partner's theatrical fantasy and forced it to obey the merciless laws of reality. He translated poetry into the language of mathematics. He turned a dramatic gesture into a working drawing. He calculated the load on the foundation where Vanbrugh saw only pathos. He was the brain of the operation, the silent engineer who, time and again, saved the playwright's castles in the air from inevitable collapse. But looming over them both, like a thundercloud, was the third, the micromanager, the Earl of Carlisle himself. He wasn't just the client, he was the third, most unpredictable force in this equation. His letters flew to London almost daily. He demanded a grander scale. He changed plans on the fly. He interfered in every detail, from the shape of the window frames to the placement of the chimneys. Every coin spent gave him the right to a creative veto, and he used it mercilessly. He cared neither for Vanbrugh's theatrical harmony nor Hawksmoor's engineering logic. He cared for only one thing, that every stone should scream of his, Carlyle's greatness. Their correspondence, which has survived to this day, is not a dry exchange of technical data. It is a psychological drama in 3 acts. Vanbrugh writes of grandeur and effect. Hawksmoor replies, writing of the weight of stone and the reliability of the foundation. And Carlyle writes to them both, demanding that the grandeur become even grander, regardless of weight and foundation. It was an eternal argument between vision, reality, and ambition. Castle Howard is not the result of harmony. It is an argument frozen in stone. Every line, every curve is a compromise, wrested from years of battles between 3 obsessed men. They created a masterpiece not because of, but in spite of one another. They had won the war on paper, but now they had to battle something far more stubborn than the Earl's ambition or the laws of physics. They now had to battle Yorkshire itself. Building a castle is not an act of creation. It is an invasion. And when the sound of hammers echoed through the hills of Yorkshire in 1699, it was the signal for the start of a war against nature, against logistics, against time itself. The first enemy was the land. Yorkshire clay, stubborn and unyielding. Hundreds of laborers tore into it, digging pits for foundations that would have to bear the weight of an entire city of stone. These were not skilled builders from London. They were local farmers, yesterday's plowmen, whose hands were accustomed to the wood of a plow, not the handle of a pickaxe. Their labor was cheap, their lives expendable. Then came the battle for resources. Every stone for this castle is a scar on the body of Yorkshire. New quarries were opened in the surrounding hills, their explosions echoing through the valleys, frightening the livestock. A dedicated brickyard was built on the estate, its chimneys beginning to foul a sky that had remained crystal clear for centuries. A sawmill ran non-stop, devouring oak groves that had stood since the Norman conquest. On his land, the Earl of Carlisle created a self-sufficient industrial zone, a factory for the production of greatness. But extracting the materials was only half the battle. They had to be delivered. And here began the war with the roads, or rather, with their absence. There were no paved highways. There were only rutted tracks that turned into impassable bogs after every rain. Dozens of ox teams, straining, dragged multi-ton blocks of stone. Wheels broke, axles cracked, loads tumbled into ravines. A journey that takes 10 minutes by car today could then last several days. Every delivery was a small military operation, requiring planning, brute force, and luck. But the quietest and most bitter war was the one against the people. We remember that the village of Henderskelfe was wiped from the face of the earth, but its inhabitants did not disappear. They were relocated, given new lands, but deprived of their homes, their church, the graves of their ancestors. And to expand the park, land was expropriated from neighboring landowners, not always willingly. We won't find records of loud riots in the archives. This was an era when a lord's will was law. But we can imagine the low grumbling in local taverns, the curses whispered under their breath. For the Earl of Carlisle, this was the creation of a dream landscape. For the local people, it was the slow, inexorable conquest of their world. This castle did not grow harmoniously from the land. It was imposed upon it by force. It is a scar from a grand battle that one man waged against an entire county. He won. But the price of that victory is forever etched into every stone, into every curve of the road that leads to its base. There are details that adorn a building. There are elements that define its style. And then there is that which becomes its soul, its heart, its ultimate statement. For Castle Howard, that statement was the dome, And this was not just an architectural decision. It was heresy, frozen in stone. Until that moment in English history, the dome had been a sacred symbol, almost divine. It crowned cathedrals, temples, the greatest of public buildings. The dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, a creation of Christopher Wren, was the visible embodiment of national faith and power, a symbol of rebirth after the Great Fire. It belonged to God and the crown. No one, not a single aristocrat, no matter how powerful, dared to usurp this symbol. Carlyle dared. To raise a dome over a private house was an unheard-of audacity. It was a direct, unveiled quotation of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a visual scream, heard for hundreds of miles. Carlyle was telling everyone, "My house is my temple, my power is my religion, and I, Charles Howard, am equal in my ambitions to the nation, and in my pride, to God himself." It was the most expensive, most complex, and most provocative gesture in the entire project. A gesture that could either immortalize his name or turn him into a laughingstock. The task of bringing this heresy to life fell on the shoulders of Nicholas Hawksmoor. And here, far from Vanbrugh's theatrical fantasies, his quiet, somber genius revealed itself. To build such a gigantic dome atop a residential house with its complex system of walls and floors was an engineering nightmare. It had to be light enough not to collapse the entire building beneath it, and strong enough to withstand the furious Yorkshire winds. Hawksmoor created a structure that was a marvel of engineering for its time. He used not massive stonework, but a complex system of wooden trusses and lead cladding. He distributed the weight onto 8 massive piers, cleverly concealed within the walls of the central hall. He solved hundreds of problems invisible to the eye, any one of which could have been fatal, while Vanbrugh and Carlyle dreamed of the celestial painting on the dome's inner surface. Hawksmoor alone battled gravity, so that this heaven would not one day come crashing down on their heads. When the scaffolding was finally removed, and the dome was revealed in all its splendor, England gasped, some in delight, others in horror. Carlyle got what he wanted. He got a symbol of absolute power, a dominant feature that subjugated the entire surrounding landscape for miles. He had challenged the heavens, and the heavens, as they so often do, accepted the challenge. But they did not answer immediately. They waited their turn for almost 2.5 centuries. Power is not just a privilege, it is also access to money. And Charles Howard, as First Lord of the Treasury, sat at the very heart of the British Empire's financial system. He was a master of political alchemy, capable of turning influence into gold. And this gold flowed like a river to the north, to Yorkshire, to feed his grand design. But stone has its own, insatiable appetite. The initial budget of £8,000 sterling was not just exceeded. It was mocked, trampled, and left far behind. Castle Howard became a financial black hole, a stone vortex that sucked in everything it could reach. First, it consumed the income from his public offices. Then, the rents from his family lands. When even that wasn't enough, the Earl had to start selling what his ancestors had accumulated for centuries. Entire estates in other counties, parcels of land that were part of his heritage. Every ton of stone hoisted onto the scaffolding was paid for with an acre of sold land. Every ounce of gilding on the ceilings was a promissory note, the interest on which would still be paid by his grandchildren. Meanwhile, in London, in the corridors of power, his enemies watched and waited. They saw the country's most powerful financier desperately scrambling for money for a personal project. They heard the rumors of his Yorkshire madness, his long absence from the capital, his obsession with blueprints and estimates became his greatest vulnerability. While he battled with contractors, his political rivals were fighting their own, far more important battle for positions and influence. The castle, which was meant to be a monument to his omnipotence, had become his Achilles' heel. It became proof of his vanity, his detachment from reality, his financial insolvency. The denouement was swift and brutal. While he was building a symbol of power, he lost power itself. In 1715, Carlisle loses his post as First Lord of the Treasury. He no longer manages the nation's treasury. Now he is just an aristocrat, desperately trying to keep his own budget afloat as it sinks under the weight of stone. He won the architectural battle. His dome rose to the heavens, visible for many miles. But he lost the political war. He was no longer a major player. He had become a spectator, locked in the world's most luxurious box seat, which he had built for himself. He won eternity in stone, but he lost his place in history, at least in the history he intended to write himself. Note to self: need more scathing quotes here. Today, we look at Castle Howard through the prism of 2.5 centuries of admiration. To us, it is an undisputed masterpiece, an icon. But in its time, its appearance provoked not only delight, it gave rise to a chorus of scathing, skeptical, and openly hostile voices. Not everyone was ready to applaud this stone giant. The quietest, yet most significant doubts came from within. Nicholas Hawksmoor, the man whose genius held together Vanbrugh's fantasies, did not mince his words in private letters. He saw the project not as a masterpiece, but as a monstrous, impractical mistake. He called it mad and chaotic. For a professional accustomed to mathematical harmony and logic, the castle's theatrical bombast was an insult to common sense. He built it, but he did not love it. He saw its weak points, its internal contradictions, its fate of perpetual maintenance problems. But while Hawksmoor grumbled under his breath, others shouted from the rooftops. When Horace Walpole, the arbiter of taste and the most acerbic critic of his era, arrived in Yorkshire, he was not impressed. He did not see harmony. He saw a jumble. His verdict was merciless. "It looks to me," he wrote, "as if huge pieces of the castle had scampered down from different hills and met here by accident. The whole ensemble is a triumph of bad taste." To him, it was not a palace, but an architectural circus, where every element was screaming, trying to outshout its neighbor. Other critics were more specific. They pointed to the building's flagrant impracticality. The enormous halls with their towering ceilings were impossible to heat. To warm the great hall in winter, you'd have to burn a small forest. The corridors were too long, and the layout of the rooms was illogical. This was a house designed to impress guests arriving for a single evening, not to be lived in. These voices created a counterpoint to the official grandeur. They were a reminder that the history of architecture is not just a story of triumphs, but also a story of disputes over taste, money, and purpose. For the Earl of Carlisle, Castle Howard was the embodiment of his power and genius. For the playwright Vanbrugh, it was a stage for a grand play. But for many of their contemporaries, it was simply the most expensive, the largest, and the most tasteless mistake in the history of English architecture. They were wrong in their assessment of its future influence, but they were absolutely right about one thing. This house was born to provoke arguments, and it would continue to do so for centuries. Note to self: need to focus more on the drama of the loss here. Construction had been going on for 27 years. It wasn't just a building project, it was a way of life. An entire generation of workers had grown up on that scaffolding. But this slow, agonizing creation had one center, one engine that fueled it with its energy. And that was John Vanbrugh. He wasn't just an architect. He was the keeper of the vision. Only he could see the final harmony in the chaos of the construction site. Only he could convince the Earl of Carlisle of the need for yet another costly detail, justifying it not with building codes, but with the laws of dramatic art. He was the soul, the ideologue, the high priest of this stone cult. Hawksmoor could calculate the loads, Carlisle could pay the bills, but only Vanbrugh knew what the final line in this great play was supposed to be. In 1726, that engine stopped. The death of John Vanbrugh was not just a personal tragedy, it was a catastrophe for the project. Overnight, the project lost its chief and sole author. It was orphaned. Imagine the set of a great film where the director dies in the middle of production. The actors know their lines, the camera operators know how to work the cameras, but no one knows how the story is supposed to end. That is exactly what happened in Yorkshire. A period of chaos ensued. Work continued out of inertia, following the old blueprints, but without a singular authorial vision. The spark that turned stone into art was gone. Nicholas Hawksmoor, the brilliant pragmatist, tried to take control, but he could not replace Vanbrugh. He could build a wall, but he couldn't imbue it with meaning. The Earl of Carlisle, now older and burdened by debt, grew increasingly detached from the project. The death of an architect is always a turning point. But here, it was something more. It was a fracture that guaranteed the castle would never be finished as it was conceived. Vanbrugh's death opened the door to future conflicts, to the wills of others, to compromises. It left behind England's greatest architectural torso, magnificent, but forever unfinished. The void he left behind was not just a creative vacuum. It was an open wound in the body of the building, and very soon, this wound would be filled with new, foreign blood that would forever change its appearance and its destiny. The lead actor had left the stage, but the play, to the horror of those who remained, had to go on. A great house should be the anchor of a dynasty, a stone testament to a single heritage, passed from father to son, unshakable and eternal. But what happens when the next in line does not admire the heritage, but despises it? What if he looks upon his ancestors' life's work and sees only a glaring, tasteless mistake? After Carlisle's death in 1738, control over the unfinished giant passed to his son-in-law, the fourth Earl, and this man was a child of a new era. For him, his father-in-law's lavish, emotional, theatrical Baroque style was not the pinnacle of art, but a garish relic of the past. It was too loud, too excessive, too personal. The new fashion that had captured the minds of the English aristocracy demanded something different: restraint, logic, a cold, rational beauty. Its name was Palladianism. This was a dispute between two worldviews, two philosophies, frozen in stone. Baroque was the language of absolute power and personal drama. Palladianism was the language of reason, order, and aristocratic detachment. And the fourth Earl, instead of humbly finishing the project in his predecessor's style, decided to correct it. He committed an act of architectural sacrilege. He built the West Wing. This is not just another part of the building. It is a direct, cold rebuke to everything that was built before it. The West Wing does not continue the dialogue. It cuts it off mid-sentence. On one side of the castle, curves, emotion, drama. On the other, straight lines, symmetry, mathematical precision. It is architectural schizophrenia, a building that argues with itself. Castle Howard ceased to be a unified whole. It became an architectural battleground between generations, a monument to a family conflict, a dispute over tastes and values that will never be resolved. This asymmetry we see today is not a builder's mistake. It is a scar left by a war of generations, a war that the old Earl, lying in his mausoleum, lost. He had built the perfect stage for the drama of his own greatness. He just never imagined that the next act of this drama would be dedicated to his overthrow. But he didn't just build a house. He built an entire universe around it, and it was there, beyond the castle walls, that his original vision unfolded with an even greater, almost frightening power. Note to self, need to focus more on the drama of the loss here. The castle was the heart, but not the whole story. To understand the true scale of Carlyle's and Vanbrugh's ambitions, you have to step outside its walls. Because they weren't just creating a house with a garden. They were building an entire universe, a choreographed landscape designed to control a visitor's emotions long before they even saw the main facade. The journey began 4 miles from the castle. You don't enter the estate through a simple gate, but through a triumphal arch. And this is the first act of the play. This is Rome, transported to Yorkshire. From the very beginning, you are made to understand. You are not entering a private estate. You are stepping into the territory of an empire. The road winds, hiding and then revealing the views. This is not the shortest path. It is the most dramatic. Vanbrugh uses the hills and forests like theatrical wings. Every turn is a new, meticulously composed scene. In the distance, on a hilltop, you see an obelisk. It doesn't commemorate any event. It simply exists to guide your gaze, to create a sense of depth and scale. Then you cross a bridge that, in its monumentality, could grace a capital city. It spans a stream you could cross in 3 steps. But its purpose isn't functionality. Its purpose is awe. And then, in a clearing between the trees, they appear. Temples. The Temple of the Four Winds, an elegant, almost weightless pavilion, offering a perfect, pastoral view of the valley. This is a world of harmony, a world of ancient wisdom. But this is just a prelude. The culmination of this entire journey, its emotional and spiritual center, lies away from the main house. It is the mausoleum, the final creation of Nicholas Hawksmoor, and many consider it his greatest masterpiece, even more perfect than the castle itself. It is not merely a tomb. It is an architectural meditation on eternity. A vast, majestic rotunda, encircled by columns, stands atop a hill, dominating the entire landscape. It is visible from almost every point on the estate, a constant, silent reminder of death and immortality. Carlyle and Vanbrugh created an Eden, but it wasn't a paradise garden for relaxation. It was a machine for crushing the will. Every step on this land, every viewpoint, every architectural trinket was part of a single script, a script meant to instill in the guest a sense of their own insignificance in the face of the owner's titanic will and limitless wealth. You didn't just come to visit an earl. You made a pilgrimage to a living God who had, with his own hands, created an entire world for himself. And at the center of this world stood the castle, which, strangely enough, was still not finished. Note to self, need to focus more on the drama of loss here. Construction began when William III sat on the English throne and Newton was still formulating his laws. It formally ended when Napoleon was already preparing his invasion of Russia. 1699 to 1811. More than a century, 3 generations of the Howard family dedicated their lives, their fortunes, and their nerves to one endless construction project. This wasn't a construction project. It was a dynastic relay race that no one wanted to run, but everyone was forced to. Imagine, the world around is changing at a dizzying speed. The Industrial Revolution is beginning to belch smoke from chimneys on the horizon. America declares its independence. In France, the guillotine sends aristocrats just like the Howards to the scaffold. Fashions change, technologies change, the very concept of beauty changes. And here, in Yorkshire, stonemasons are still slowly, day after day, dressing stone for another cornice. The Earl of Carlisle, the man whose ego gave birth to this giant, never saw his creation completed. He died surrounded by scaffolding, in a house where one wing was luxuriously finished, and the other was bare brickwork. His son and grandson continued the work, but without the initial fire. For them, it was not the creation of a dream, but the fulfillment of a duty to the name, to the legacy, to the colossal sums of money already invested. And herein lies the greatest irony of Castle Howard. It was conceived as the most modern, the most daring architectural statement of its era, an ultra-fashionable manifesto of power and taste. But because it took so unbearably long to build, by the time it was finished, it had already become a relic. It was magnificent, stunning, but a hopelessly outdated anachronism, like a dinosaur that survived into the age of mammals. 100 years of construction turned it not into a monument to progress, but into a monument to stubbornness. It was frozen in time before it was even born, and this loneliness, this alienation from the forward-rushing world, became its new, unforeseen essence. It became an island of the past in an ocean of the present. The construction was over. The war between generations had subsided. Now, the castle faced its most difficult trial. It had to begin to live. But was this golden cage fit for life? When the last stonemason left, the castle finally began its own life. But was it the life its creator had dreamed of? Was this grandiose stage a happy home? The history, recorded not in architectural plans but in diaries and letters, says otherwise. The castle became not a cozy nest, but a huge, cold, ruthless machine that demanded constant sacrifices from its owners. Its upkeep devoured fortunes. Its scale dictated a way of life. You couldn't just live here. You had to measure up. In 1850, Queen Victoria herself arrived. A separate railway station was built for her visit. Months were spent on preparations, on updating the interiors, on rehearsing receptions. But the monarch's verdict was withering. She found the interior decor too garish, too theatrical. In that short phrase lies the entire tragedy of the castle. It was built to impress, but by the mid-19th century, its drama already seemed vulgar. Life here bustled, but it was rarely happy. In these halls shone Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, the most famous woman of her era. She threw balls, wove political intrigues, and gambled away entire fortunes at the card table. The castle was a perfect backdrop for her, but not a home. For others, it became a place of tragedy. The 9th Earl, a talented artist, watched his hopes crumble along with the empire. His eldest son, his heir, was killed in a colonial war in Sudan. The vast, echoing rooms, created to celebrate dynastic triumph, now echoed his grief. The castle presents itself not as an idyllic estate, but as a demanding deity. It granted status, but in return, it took away freedom and peace of mind. Every generation of Howards fought its own war for survival, selling paintings to repair the roof, closing off entire wings to save on heating. They were not owners, but custodians, hostages to the ambitions of their 18th century ancestor. This golden cage was beautiful, but its bars were forged from debt and obligation, and the most terrible ordeal was yet to come. It would not arrive with bailiffs or critics. It would come from the sky on one cold November night. November 9th, 1940. Britain is fighting a war for survival. German bombers are leveling Coventry. But here in Yorkshire, the war seems distant. Castle Howard is doing its patriotic duty. An evacuated girls' school has been housed within its walls. 100 young lives have found refuge under the shadow of its centuries-old history. No one could have imagined that the greatest threat would come not from the sky, but from within. The cause was laughably mundane. A blocked chimney in the south wing. A spark from the fireplace, which for centuries had provided warmth, on this night gave birth to an inferno. It all started with a thin wisp of smoke. Then, a scream from one of the schoolgirls. And then a roar. The roar of a fire that, finding an outlet in the dry wooden structures, began to devour everything in its path with insatiable fury. Panic. Girls in nightgowns run down corridors that, in minutes, turn into smoke traps. Teachers try to organize an evacuation. But the fire was faster. It raced through the enfilades, consuming priceless tapestries, paintings by old masters, furniture created by the era's finest cabinet makers. The gold on the walls melted and ran in black tears. And then the flames reached the heart of the castle, the great hall. It shot upwards, towards the ceiling, towards Pellegrini's famous painting, towards the mythological heavens that were Carlyle's pride, and further, to the dome, to that very dome that was a challenge thrown down to God. The wooden rafters, Hawksmoor's ingenious creation, held for 2 hours. And then, with a deafening, apocalyptic crash that was heard for miles, the dome collapsed. 200 tons of lead and burning timber crashed into the center of the building, punching through floors all the way to the cellars. The heart of the castle was torn out. Its main symbol, its soul, had become a fiery hole gaping at the black, wartime sky. By morning, it was all over. 20 rooms were destroyed. The south facade was a blackened skeleton, and in the center of the castle, where its triumph had been, there was now a void. For the next 20 years, the great hall would stand open to the sky. Rain and snow would fall on the marble floor. The wind would howl through the ruins. It seemed this was the end. The fire had finished what neither critics nor debts could. It had turned a masterpiece into an ancient ruin. The story of Castle Howard, it seemed, was complete, and its finale was written in ash. The ashes had cooled, but the chill of oblivion was more terrifying than the fire. Post-war England was holding an auto-da-fe for its aristocratic history, bulldozing hundreds of similar houses that had become an unbearable burden for their ruined owners. Castle Howard was on the execution list. The family was on the brink of bankruptcy. Vast, maimed, with a hole where its heart should be, it was a perfect candidate for demolition. Its story, it seemed, had reached its logical, tragic conclusion. And then, when all hope was lost, a miracle occurred. But it didn't arrive in the form of a government grant or a sudden inheritance. It arrived in the form of a film crew. In 1980, Granada Television was looking for a location to film a series based on Evelyn Waugh's novel, Brideshead Revisited. They needed a house that was both magnificent and touched by decay. They found it here. Something incredible happened. A fictional story came to the rescue of a real building. While the cameras were filming a nostalgic drama about the decline of the aristocracy, a real-life drama about its salvation was unfolding off-screen. The myth began to pay the bills. When the series aired, it became a global sensation, and thousands, then hundreds of thousands, of tourists from all over the world flocked to Yorkshire. But they weren't traveling to Castle Howard. They were traveling to Brideshead. They didn't want to see the architectural whim of the Earl of Carlisle, but the place where the fictional characters, Sebastian and Charles, had lived. Every ticket purchased by a tourist wanting to touch fiction turned into a real pound sterling that went to pay the bills of real stonemasons. The money earned from nostalgia went towards restoration. The dome, destroyed by fire, was rebuilt not only with the family's funds, but with the money brought in by the power of a cultural myth. The castle survived, but it paid with its soul. Today, Castle Howard is a thriving business enterprise. It is one of England's most popular tourist attractions. It's a filming location for Hollywood movies and series like Bridgerton. It survived not because of the strength of its stone, but because of the flexibility of its image. The ambitions of an 18th century earl were saved and rewritten by a 20th century novel, only to become a 21st century cultural phenomenon. But if you walk around it, you will see its scar. The unfinished West Wing, a monument to a family conflict, a dispute over taste. It will forever remain a reminder that even the grandest human designs rarely outlive their creators in the form they were conceived. The original vision is dead, but the building, having found a new, unpredictable life, continues to stand. The story continues. This castle was born as an irrefutable statement of power, forged from ego and political calculation. But having outlived its creator, its enemies, and even the empire itself, it became something more, a mirror in which each generation sees a reflection of its own myths, dreams, and delusions. So, what in the end proves to be stronger? The stone that holds the cold memory of its ruthless creator, or the beautiful illusion we so desperately want to see in it? Share your thoughts on this in the comments. And if you found this dialogue about the nature of power and beauty to be important, support us with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our future explorations.